We have Sarah Hodges, who is a wonderful executive coach, back with us today to talk about self-care for founders. This is our part 2 of a quick series on really how founders and founders of healthcare startups can take care of themselves and excel as leaders and be good leaders by focusing on the things that matter, which is first and foremost self-care. In a time that is uncertain as today, it's really, really important to focus on this. Right now, Sarah has done a webinar with us before, part 1 of kind of a self-care series, Self-Care 101. She's an incredible executive coach. She had some wonderful things to share with our founders and other entrepreneurs out there, kind of thinking about how they can best take care of themselves so that they can take care of their teams and their companies. This was said, we say it to our founders, and it was said at our, Founders Summit back in November, as early stage investors, we're investing in people, we're investing in the teams. And if we can't trust our founders to take care of themselves, how can we trust that they're going to take care of their companies and their own teams? And so with that, I really want to just hand this whole thing over to Sarah. She's got a great recap of what we talked about in part 1, but she's also going to be introducing some new ideas and new ways that founders can focus on self-care, particularly as it relates to their leadership for startup founders. So Sarah, you take it away.
Thanks, Alex. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of this. So self-care and leadership. Our agenda today has 4 basic steps. We're going to review what we talked about last time. We're going to review stress, kind of 101, self-care 101, and then expand on that and help you understand how it's important as a leader and how you can use it as a leader to help others in your company as well. And then we're going to talk about COVID, because it'd be kind of weird not to, right? It's the elephant in the room. We don't want to spend the whole time talking about that because we're inundated with stuff all day. So to recap from last time, startup success is a marathon, not a sprint. And so how can you reach the finish line with your health and your relationships intact? We mentioned this last time. Divorces and heart attacks often happen right after you have an exit. We don't want that for you guys. The problem is that you have no time. You are in meetings with investors, you're running your companies. This is your life 24/7. And so it's really difficult to say, okay, I'm going to go for a run or I'm going to make a nutritious meal. It's really hard to do. But let's pause that for a second and talk about stress basics. And last time I said I'm going to blow your mind and tell you that stress is good, because it is. I mean, even right now, like our stress responses are survival, not that, we need 500 rolls of toilet paper, but in general, our stress response is what keeps us alive and safe in, life or death situations. But stress is also how we grow. It's how we intentionally grow. You put a stress on your muscle, over time, your muscle grows bigger, right? You try to learn a new idea, over time you learn more, and the actual learning can be stressful. Starting a company is stressful, but it's still a good stress. It's going to help you grow and further your company's mission. The chronic stress is the part that's bad, okay? And we all know that chronic stress causes pathology in the body, but I want to focus on how it causes pathology in the brain. It actually hypertrophies your amygdala. So your amygdala gets bigger and you get more sensitive to stress triggers. So as opposed to like being more resilient to stress, if you suffer under chronic stress, you can become less resilient to stress. But not only that, when you are in a fight or flight situation, when you're under chronic stress, the majority of your energy is going here to your lizard brain, to your brain stem, to that fight or flight autopilot. This is where you react. You react at your spouse, you react at your staff. You start to maybe withdraw even, right? Because that's a more flight response, and you don't feel motivated anymore. And we have the mammal brain here, which we're going to talk about a lot today, and that is your limbic system, where emotions live. And then we have your human brain, your neocortex, and up here is your prefrontal cortex. And that's really important because that is required for the skills necessary to be successful in a startup. So if you want to use critical thinking, decision making, really genuinely connect with other people, that requires full utilization of your PFC. So if you're struggling under chronic stress all the time, you're not bringing your best brain to the job. Chronic stress hijacks your brain. So what happens is you're coming to work, you're working more hours, trying to get more done, which is just contributing to more chronic stress. And so you're working harder, not smarter. And that's where the self-care comes in, because recovery is absolutely essential. That's how you keep stress from being chronic, which means after each stress trigger, your body and brain need to recover to avoid negative chronic stress, which means self-care is essential. Self-care is what we can use for recovery to help bring our body back into, and our mind back into homeostasis. The problem, though, you have no time, right? We circle back to that piece. So last time I suggested that it starts with self-talk, that if you become more aware of when I called it your inner a-hole, is really torturing you, talking about limiting beliefs, you can't do this, you suck, you're never going to get that investment, blah, 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 as this happens to every single human being because we're human beings, you can talk back. And using Kristen Neff's studies in self-compassion, which has 3 primary parts. First is mindfulness. I call that labeling the emotion, which is, what emotion do I feel? Common humanity, is it normal? Self-kindness, what do I need? And we did a couple examples of these last time. Right now I feel overwhelmed. Is it normal to feel that way? Yeah, everyone is in the same boat as me right now. What do I need? I need to wear pajama pants to do my presentation today. So whatever it may be for you, that self-kindness piece is really important and really intentional. And what's cool about self-compassion is that it neutralizes chronic stress. We've seen that with studies in salivary cortisol. And so here's some stats for you. It also reduces physiological stress when we've measured for heart rate, blood pressure, heart rate variability, and salivary cortisol. And more importantly, it protects against the negative physiological effects of chronic stress, which means that you become more resilient to future potential for chronic stress. And, it's counterintuitive, but self-compassion actually motivates you. It motivates you to improve personal weaknesses, and it kind of garners growth mindset. It also makes you less risk averse, because it reduces fears of failure and improves coping strategies, because if something bad happens, I know how to handle it. You're compassionate enough with yourself to find a new solution. And it helps you bounce back from failures and regrets. So self-compassion is what makes you more resilient, not undergoing chronic stress. Okay, now let's talk about self-care for leaders. So we've recapped everything. We understand how this affects your brain, how this affects your body, how it's counterintuitive. But now what? How do you use this with your staff? How do you use this to further your company's mission? So I'm going to talk to you about the spaghetti marshmallow challenge, which I freaking love, because they did the study and they've replicated it many times. They took 20 sticks of spaghetti, a yard of tape, a yard of string, and a marshmallow, and said, which group of 4 can build the tallest tower in 18 minutes with the marshmallow on top? And they put recent business school graduates against kindergarteners, which I think is hilarious. And you can imagine who won: the kindergarteners, right? I'm so excited about it. Now, why is that? And the kindergarteners, no one cared who was in charge. There was more doing and less talking. They were just shoulder to shoulder trying to build all of these prototypes. And every time they built a prototype, they had the goal in mind. They had the marshmallow on top, okay? Where the business school grads, that's like, oh, who's in charge? Where do I rank? They tried to build the perfect prototype before they even got started. And then when they built it, they threw the marshmallow on top at the end, and oftentimes it collapsed. So what can we learn from that? Well, we know that one of the biggest predicting factors of team performance is social safety. The kindergarteners had social safety. They weren't sitting there ranking each other and trying to figure out who was more important. They felt safe. They were all collectively taking risk, and they were focused on the mission at hand. But, how do we create this for adults? Well, let's look at the brain. And we can, by looking at the brain, we can see that empathy is really the key to creating this for adults. So let's go back to the mammal brain. And let's say that people are not feeling safe, okay? They're down here in lizard brain. In order to get back up to human brain, in order to fully utilize their highest brain function and their prefrontal cortex, you can't just jump from one to the other, okay? You have to go through the limbic system and through the mammal brain, and that requires the use of a language of emotion. So here's some examples of what that may sound like. Example 1, I imagine this task load feels overwhelming. How can you break it down into smaller pieces? So you're empathizing first of how it feels. I sense you feel frustrated at this change to your schedule, don't we all? How can I support you to make this easier? These are examples that leaders can draw from to use empathy in their conversations with staff. So here's some cool stats. From Google, Project Aristotle, it's what I was saying earlier, that the most important factor for team performance and success is psychological safety. And a feeling of belonging, that feeling of like, you know, we're family. You just kind of intuit each other. You can sense into each other as opposed to having to, you know, prove who's on top all the time. And shame, which is a major trigger of stress, is relieved through empathy. So if anyone is feeling, you know, fear of failure, I feel like they're not measuring up, or that imposter syndrome, empathy can really help relieve that. So much like the formula for, you know, compassion, for self-compassion, I have a formula for compassionate conversations. And it may look something like this, you know, although there's innumerable ways to adjust this for your particular scenario. It could be, I imagine you feel, and always give them a chance to clarify their emotion, because, you know, you could be wrong, but it doesn't matter if you're wrong or you're right. What matters is you're connecting with them on an emotional level. So if you are wrong and they clarify for you, that's still a good thing. And then if you want, you can share your feelings, you know, and remind them that you're a human too. So you're connecting on that emotional level. And then you're drawing yourself up to human brain, using your PFC and problem solving. How can we come to a solution together? This could also be like, hey, I'm sensing that, you know, I've noticed that, how can I help support you here? And really that last piece is the self-kindness piece, but it's kindness to another. This can also be a great way in confrontation to set a boundary. Like, I recognize that this is important to you, you know, and yet here is the boundary. So it makes it easier for people to hear what you're saying, whether it's a directive or a genuine desire to help, if you start with empathy. But it starts with you, okay? You cannot create social safety or have a compassionate conversation if you're operating from lizard brain, right? Like, if you're stressed out, if you're triggered, you're not going to be able to go and elevate somebody else's brain through empathy, because you can't access your own. You have to first go through the steps of self-compassion, and that is why we start with self-leadership before we talk, and in self-management and self-care for you, before we talk about leading others. So again, you must empathize from a place of human brain. So before you go into these conversations, you need to be asking yourself, how am I feeling? Well, I'm feeling stressed out. You know, is that normal? And what can I do as an act of kindness for myself to intentionally de-stress? And that is the formula that is going to be most beneficial for you to then go in and, you know, create that environment of social safety, which we know predicts team performance. So to bring it around town, the most important factor for social safety is the self-care and mental and physical well-being of the leader. So it's time to take time for you to work smarter, not harder. All right, let's talk about COVID, because these are crazy times, as Eller said, right? These are crazy times. And, you know, it's the elephant in the room. We can't have a discussion about self-care for leaders without talking about the fact that our environment is inherently chronically stressful, right? Many of us are living in isolation. There is a tremendous amount of uncertainty. There's real danger here, right? There are people dying. And the change has been extremely sudden, and many of us are immobilized, right? We can't go anywhere. So this is this, it's like the perfect storm for chronic stress. And your email boxes, I'm gonna go TED talk on you here, okay, for a second, and talk about some of my personal experience, because your email inboxes are being inundated with all sorts of like, here's 5 tips to be more productive at home, and here's 25 websites to educate your child, and here's self-care tips, get outside and go for a run, and inside you're like, ah, and there's too much right now. There's too much. And maybe a lucky couple of you, in this webinar are like, oh no, I'm actually, I work from home all the time. This is great. I'm an introvert and I've been preparing for this my whole life. Well then, kudos to you. Enjoy your solitary confinement. But for many of us, this sudden shift is really scary. And more importantly, for some of your team members, this sudden shift is really scary. But I've also seen some stuff on social media about, like, that you just have to, your grandparents were called to war, you're being called to sit on your couch. There's not much room right now for how we are feeling. And listen, guys, like I'm talking a lot about feelings and using in general, right? I'm talking about using feelings to access higher brain function, but feelings are also very, very important when you're recovering from extreme situations. And this is an extreme situation. And I haven't talked about myself at all, right? But, and I often don't, but in my own life, I mean, it wasn't a fear of death, but, I was married for 7.5 years. And then my husband comes home one day and tells me he's gay. And I didn't have a penny in the bank. I had to work 6 jobs in New York City and was still an opera singer. That was freaking stressful, right? Like life, there was a sudden change, a lot of uncertainty. I didn't know where to turn. And then a few years later, I watched my brother slowly die of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and held his body as he took his last breath. Okay. And then grandma died 6 weeks later. And then a year after that, I delivered a stillborn baby. So when I am telling you that emotions are important, it's not just because of the science, and it's not just because of it's worked for my clients. I have personally put these techniques through fire, and they say the strongest steel goes through the hottest fire. That's these techniques. And so I'm saying this to tell you that the other evening, I was sitting, I was sitting in my bedroom, and I just started to feel really overwhelmed, and I started to cry. And I intentionally recognized I'm feeling overwhelmed, and I let myself cry. I didn't let myself cry because I'm weak or I'm super sensitive, and those things are okay too. It's okay to be sensitive, but I let myself cry because it was healthy, because it was an intentionally healthy choice to let myself feel the feels. If you do not let yourself feel the feels, it's going to be very difficult to recover from chronic stress, and the chronic stress of this experience. So even if you do say, I'm going to go for a run for, because I'm supposed to self-care. I'm going to make a nutritious meal because I'm supposed to self-care. It's not going to be as effective if you say, I am feeling really anxious right now, and so I'm going to go for a run. Like if you don't walk through the emotion first before you take the action, it's not going to be as impactful because it's not going to be as intentional. So I want to encourage all of you to use these techniques, not just, in your work, right? But also as individuals to help care for yourself to get through this. I see that you popped in, Eller.
I did pop back in because I just wanted to kind of make it even real, because thank you for sharing your story, Sarah. I think that's incredibly impactful, and it really drives home this point. But for any founders that are listening in, I just want to say that this has happened with Jumpstart portfolio companies, with the founders in our day-to-day lives. I had a founder, and just to kind of add another story, I had a founder who was having to go through a pretty difficult decision he kind of got, screwed by some investors that were going to invest, and then they pulled the plug, and then that had a waterfall effect of, some high profile customers that he had that were driving, over 80% of his revenue, pulled their contracts. Everything started falling around him. And unfortunately, I wish I could say his reaction to it was driven with, self-awareness and feelings, but instead he really, it was almost like he was just froze. And this is a grown man who has worked in startups before, but because he was unable, and I talked him through this, I mean, he was unable to really dive into, this is a tough and scary thing that you're going through right now. It was almost like he couldn't touch that, and he was immobilized, and it took him days, and if not, weeks to really kind of dig in and touch that part of like the feeling and emotion of, holy shit, this just happened to me, and I'm going to have to fire almost my entire team. I'm going to have to completely rework the strategy behind my company, because now my largest client is no longer, I can no longer count on that revenue coming in. And I just lost kind of my potential lead investor in this round, all in the matter of 2 days. And because he wasn't able to really touch on that, the feeling and emotional side of it, he was so confused and I literally say immobilized. And it took a number of conversations with him. And sometimes I feel like, as a managing director of a portfolio of startup companies, some of my work is just being the person to talk to when they're freaking out, and kind of getting people to tap into, this is scary and this is tough, but it will be okay. Gives way to some clarity on next steps. And it's tough, teaching that. But I think if, as Sarah, you said, if you can work on that in your day-to-day life and address, here's how I'm feeling, you can kind of address it head on, confront the feeling, and then say, and it's okay to feel that. And then here's my next step. It brings a lot of clarity. So.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And thank you so much for popping in and sharing it, because it takes it out of the context of COVID, right? And you're talking about just like real impactful, scary events that happen in business. But what you said about like, once he was able to acknowledge the feelings of it, he got a lot of clarity. There's perfect example of going through mammal brain into human brain. And that's what you experience. So if you want to manage chronic stress, do that self-compassion for yourself, but also do it for others, because as a leader, you can do what Eller did for that particular founder with your team. And that's when that's really leadership.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me pop in and share that story again. I just wanted to make it really relevant for founders that may be listening, that, it's, again, self-care, and the self-care of a founder instills confidence from your investors. Because when I was on the phone with this founder, having to talk him through, you need to recognize that this is not a good situation, and it's okay to not know what to do. I want you to sit with that. I want you to feel scared, and I want you to recognize that feeling. And then together, let's get through this tough situation, and let's come up with the next step. But because he was honestly so immobilized, it was really difficult to do that.
It makes sense. Makes perfect sense. I see that in coaching often too. So good job coaching him.
Well, I'm going to pop back out and let you jump back in.
We're ready for review. So it's perfect timing. So, what did we learn? Stress that is intentional to promote growth is good. It keeps you alive and helps you grow. Chronic stress is bad. It hijacks your brain. Recovery is absolutely essential. After each stress trigger, your body and brain need to recover to avoid negative chronic stress. And I added, especially now, and that, is self-care. Self-care is essential. If you want to create successful teams, if you want to use your best brain, your self-care, and, part of self-care is, acknowledging your emotions, that is essential. Self-compassion is essential because it neutralizes the stress response. So you can use that best brain, and that's the piece of going through the emotion. And then after you use self-compassion and you access your highest brain, you use empathy to help others do the same. So let's discuss. You have any questions from a couple?
Yeah, all right. I just opened up the Q&A and I got one question popping right in. So the question is, one method I use for frequency is sleeping on it. For big decisions, meetings, etc. Sleeping on things help me see things clearly. Thoughts and feedback on that. I'm just sleeping on it. It's a good question.
That's a really good question. You know, it sounds that there's a huge amount of self-kindness there, right? Of like, I'm going to give myself time. It's you're allowing yourself to pause instead of reacting. So even if you aren't necessarily intentionally labeling the emotion, by sleeping on it and stepping away, you're giving yourself time. You're giving yourself time to pause. And sometimes just time and distance and clarity can help pull yourself out of an automatic stress response. If you want to make that more impactful, when you say to yourself, I'm going to sleep on it, also say, I'm going to sleep on it because right now it feels, right? And then throughout the day, you know, check in on how that particular thing is feeling. And with COVID right now, check in with yourself throughout the day and say, how am I feeling right now?
Yeah.
Good question.
Great. Do we have any other questions coming in from any of the participants? All right. I don't think so, but I do have a question. Sarah, for a lot of the founders, you know, that I work with, they, you know, my advice to them, particularly when the company is maybe going through some tumultuous times, or there are some hard decisions, or the founder, the leader themselves are feeling very stressed. If they show those emotions, those real raw emotions to their immediate team members, it can sometimes, it can incite fear or scare those team members, which can then, you know, as we all know, the waterfall effect being loss of productivity, loss of confidence from the team members. So how do you think founders and leaders of organizations should manage their feelings internally with themselves and individually? And how should they approach, you know, addressing those feelings with their team members? Or do they need to bring in, you know, an outside party?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I am that outside party, right? And we kind of went here last time. Like that's always going to be a really beneficial way to go. It's to get a, you know, coach for yourself, and then potentially have that coach come in and work with you and your team in really difficult situations. And so I guess, you know, if you are going to your team and conveying emotions that instill fear, that you probably haven't done the work yourself first.
Yep.
So, and that's why we start with the self-leadership piece, the self-care piece, the self-compassion piece. So it's about going in and really understanding, you know, how you're feeling about it, seeing it from many different perspectives, broadening your perspective, getting a bird's eye view, which can be very kind to yourself, and then going to your team and having it more focused on what you can do for them, right? Like, right. I imagine you're feeling this way. I also feel this way. How can I help support you? Is different than like, I'm in a panic, figure it out so you can support me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Totally. Yeah. And I think, you know, I talked to a founder the other day that, you know, they had hired an executive coach, and he said it literally changed the way he runs his team. And he said it is something that he, you know, had been wrestling with or thinking about, you know, should I do this? Should I not? Should I make the investment? And I think what I've seen is that his company has grown substantially. And it's, you know, it wasn't something that I said, you need to hire an executive coach. He actually took that on himself, and really, you know, has made some amazing progress. One, as a leader, he's hired incredible people around him, a better listener, and honestly, just an overall more successful and better company. Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time and talking with everyone that joined today, and I look forward to staying in touch. Do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, actually. So, you know, I'm I want to give back because I know this is an unprecedented time. So if anybody, joining us today would like to have a one-on-one coaching session to deal with some of the stress management and, figure out how you can better manage it to be a better leader, I'm going to send you a follow-up email, or maybe I'll give it to Eller to send it to you, to schedule a session for a free one-on-one session. And, I want to be as helpful as I can. And just so you know, there's going to be no pressure to like, oh, did you like this? Do you want to sign up for more? Like, I'm not going to do that. It's just going to be focused on, giving you whatever you need to get through this difficult time. So please take me up on it. That's it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Really can't appreciate you for doing this enough. And I, again, encourage everyone that was on the webinar today to please reach out to Sarah if you have additional questions. Please reach out to us if you have questions as well. We're here to help, and I hope everyone's, stays safe, stays healthy, wash your hands, and practice really strong self-care through these rapidly changing and crazy times. So appreciate you joining us today and hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks. Bye.